Scaphism is one of the most infamous execution methods attributed to the ancient Achaemenid Persian Empire, and our primary detailed account comes from the Greek biographer Plutarch. According to his writings, this punishment was reserved for severe crimes such as treason. Whether every detail is historically precise or partially shaped by hostile Greek perspectives toward Persia remains debated among modern historians. However, the description itself is so vivid that it has endured for centuries as a symbol of extreme judicial cruelty. The term scaphism comes from the Greek word scaphe, meaning boat or trough. The condemned person was placed between two hollowed-out wooden boats or logs, fitted together like a shell, with only the head, hands, and feet exposed. The body was tightly secured, immobilizing the victim completely. What followed was not an immediate execution, but a prolonged process designed to extend suffering over days. The prisoner was force-fed large quantities of milk and honey. This had two purposes. First, it ensured the victim would not die quickly from starvation. Second, it caused severe diarrhea, which remained trapped inside the wooden enclosure. Honey was also smeared on the exposed parts of the body, particularly the face and limbs. The entire structure was then left in marshland or stagnant water, environments rich with insects. Drawn by the sweetness, flies and other insects gathered rapidly. They fed on the exposed flesh and laid eggs in wounds and bodily openings. Over time, maggots infested the body, leading to infection, gangrene, and septic shock. Because the victim was kept alive through forced feeding, the process could reportedly last several days. Death ultimately came from dehydration, infection, or organ failure. What made scaphism particularly terrifying was not simply the physical pain, but the methodical design behind it. It weaponized nature itself. Insects, bacteria, and exposure became instruments of execution. The punishment removed any sense of dignity, reducing the condemned to a living host for decay. It was slow, humiliating, and public in its intent. Some modern scholars question whether scaphism was widely practiced or if it was exaggerated by Greek writers to portray Persian rulers as barbaric enemies. Ancient sources often amplified cruelty when describing rival civilizations. Yet, even if the method was rare, its existence in recorded literature served a powerful psychological function. It reinforced the idea that betrayal of imperial authority would result in a fate worse than death, one that unfolded gradually and visibly. Scaphism stands out in the history of punishments because it blurred the line between execution and biological destruction. It was not simply about ending life. It was about demonstrating that the state could control the pace of death itself, stretching it into a prolonged warning. Whether entirely factual or partly shaped by ancient propaganda, the account of scaphism has endured as one of history's most disturbing examples of punishment designed to terrify through slow inevitability. Execution by elephant was a documented method of capital punishment in parts of South and Southeast Asia for centuries, particularly under powerful kingdoms such as the Mughal Empire and in regions of Siam. Unlike many execution methods that relied solely on tools or weapons, this punishment turned a living, intelligent animal into an instrument of state authority. It was not random brutality, it was structured, deliberate, and deeply symbolic. Elephants in these societies were not ordinary animals. They represented royal power, military strength, and divine authority. Kings and emperors rode them into battle, displayed them in ceremonies, and treated them as symbols of sovereignty. To use such an animal in an execution was to send a clear political message. The ruler controlled not only armies and laws, but the very forces of nature. Historical travelers, including European merchants and diplomats, recorded detailed accounts of these executions. The condemned individual would be brought into a public square or royal court. A trained elephant, guided by a mahout, would carry out the sentence. What made this method particularly terrifying was the animal's precision. Elephants could be trained to crush a skull instantly with one step or to prolong suffering by breaking limbs one by one before delivering a final blow. The pace of death depended entirely on the ruler's command. This flexibility transformed the execution into a performance of judgment. A swift crushing could be framed as merciful. A prolonged dismantling of the body signaled absolute wrath. The crowd witnessing the event understood that the animal acted under royal instruction. The elephant was not wild, it obeyed. That obedience reflected the unquestioned dominance of the throne. In some cases, elephants were also trained to dismember bodies or display them afterward, intensifying the spectacle. The sheer size of the animal amplified the psychological effect. A towering creature weighing several tons standing over a helpless human being created an image of overwhelming, unstoppable power. Unlike mechanical devices of execution, elephant punishment embodied authority in motion. It showed that justice flowed directly from the ruler's will. The execution was not hidden behind walls. It was staged where it could be seen, reinforcing hierarchy and obedience within society. Over time, as colonial administrations imposed new legal systems in the 18th and 19th centuries, such practices were gradually abolished. Yet, for centuries, execution by elephant stood as one of the most dramatic examples of punishment designed not only to kill, but to project dominance. It transformed the act of execution into a living demonstration of sovereign control, where even the mightiest creature in the land moved at the ruler's command. Gibbeting, also known as hanging in chains, was a post-execution punishment practiced primarily in 18th and early 19th century Great Britain. Unlike a standard hanging, which ended with burial, gibbeting ensured that the condemned would remain on display long after death. It was not simply about execution, it was about extending punishment beyond life and turning the corpse into a permanent public warning. After a criminal was executed, often for murder, piracy, or highway robbery, the body was placed inside a specially constructed iron cage shaped roughly to the human form. This metal framework was then suspended from a tall wooden post near roads, riverbanks, or crime scenes. The location was carefully chosen for visibility. Travelers, merchants, sailors, and local residents would pass by the decomposing remains for months or even years. The Murder Act of 1752 formally expanded the use of post-mortem punishments in Britain, including dissection and gibbeting. Lawmakers believed that the fear of having one's body denied proper burial would serve as a powerful deterrent. In a deeply religious society where burial rites were tied to dignity and spiritual beliefs, the idea of being left to rot publicly carried enormous psychological weight. The visual impact was severe. As the body decayed, it attracted birds and insects. The iron cage creaked in the wind, clothing rotted away, bones gradually became visible. In coastal regions, gibbets were sometimes erected near harbors as warnings against piracy and smuggling. The message was unmistakable. This fate awaited those who defied the law. One of the most famous examples was the gibbet of pirate William Kidd, whose body was displayed along the River Thames after his execution in 1701. His remains reportedly hung for years, serving as a grim reminder to sailors entering London. Even long after the flesh was gone, the sight of the cage itself symbolized state power. Gibbeting blurred the line between justice and spectacle. Death was not the final act. Decomposition became part of the punishment. The state controlled not only the criminal's life, but also their memory and physical remains. By denying burial and forcing the body into public view, authorities transformed the corpse into a moral billboard. By the early 19th century, shifting attitudes toward public punishment led to the decline of gibbeting. The practice was formally abolished in Britain in 1834. Yet for decades, these iron cages stood against the skyline, silent, swaying warnings that the reach of the law extended even beyond the grave. The brazen bull is one of the most infamous execution devices described in ancient sources, most commonly associated with the Greek tyrant Phalaris, who ruled the city of Acragas in ancient Greece during the 6th century BCE. According to later historical writers, this punishment device was not merely designed to kill, it was engineered to transform suffering into spectacle. The device was said to be a life-sized bull made entirely of bronze and hollow on the inside. A door allowed the condemned person to be locked within the metal chamber. Once sealed, a fire was lit beneath the statue. As the bronze heated, the person inside was slowly roasted alive. The design allegedly included a system of tubes and acoustic mechanisms within the bull's head, which converted the victim's screams into sounds resembling the bellowing of an enraged animal. This detail, whether historically accurate or embellished over time, gave the execution a theatrical dimension. Instead of hearing human cries, the crowd would hear what sounded like the roar of a beast. The condemned individual was symbolically erased, their suffering transformed into something inhuman. The bull itself became both executioner and performer. Ancient writers such as Diodorus Siculus recounted the story with vivid intensity, portraying Phalaris as a cruel ruler who used terror to consolidate power. One legend even claims that the craftsman who designed the bull was its first victim, executed inside his own invention to test its effectiveness. While historians debate the reliability of these accounts, the story endured across centuries as an example of tyranny unchecked by moral restraint. What made the brazen bull especially terrifying was its fusion of artistry and brutality. It was not a crude instrument like a sword or scaffold. It was a crafted object, polished, imposing, and symbolically powerful. Bulls in ancient Mediterranean cultures often represented strength and dominance. To be consumed inside such a figure was to be destroyed within a symbol of authority. Even if elements of the story were exaggerated by later historians seeking to condemn despotic rulers, the narrative itself served a purpose. It reinforced the idea that certain leaders ruled through fear so absolute that even execution became a calculated performance. The brazen bull stands in historical memory not simply as a method of death, but as a warning about the extremes of power, where punishment becomes art and cruelty becomes policy. Among the most unusual punishments of the ancient world was the pona koulei, a Roman execution reserved specifically for parricide, the murder of one's father, mother, or close ancestor. Practiced during the era of the Roman Republic and later codified under the Roman Empire, this penalty was not designed merely to end a life. It was meant to declare that the crime had shattered the very foundation of society. In Roman culture, family authority, especially that of the father, was sacred. The paterfamilias held legal power over the household. To kill a parent was viewed not simply as murder, but as an assault on nature, order, and divine law. Because the crime was considered unnatural, the punishment was deliberately constructed to reflect that belief. The condemned individual was first publicly flogged. They were then sewn alive into a large leather sack known as a coulius. But the execution did not end there. Inside the sack were placed live animals, traditionally a dog, a rooster, a snake, and a monkey, though the combination could vary depending on the period. The sack was tightly sealed and transported to a body of water, usually a river or the sea, where it was thrown in. Death came through drowning, panic, suffocation, or injury from the frantic animals trapped inside. The symbolism was powerful. Each creature carried cultural meaning. The dog and rooster were associated with vigilance and domestic life. The snake symbolized treachery. The monkey was often seen as a distorted imitation of humanity. By enclosing the parricide with these animals, Roman authorities sent a message: the offender had abandoned human order and would die outside it. The punishment also denied the condemned proper burial rites. In Roman belief, burial and remembrance were essential for honor in death. Being cast into water inside a sealed sack erased that possibility. It was a final act of exclusion, severing the criminal from both family and society. Though rarely applied, the Pona Collet endured in Roman legal memory for centuries because of its dramatic symbolism. It reflected a justice system that sought not only to punish the body, but to communicate moral lessons through ritual. The execution was staged as a statement. Crimes against the family were crimes against civilization itself, and the response would be as extraordinary as the offense. The practice of sawing a person in half is one of the most horrifying and extreme punishments recorded in historical chronicles, with accounts appearing in both medieval Europe and parts of Asia. Unlike conventional executions that ended life quickly, this method was designed to prolong suffering and instill maximum terror among witnesses. Though relatively rare, it became notorious precisely because of its deliberate cruelty and public nature. Historical sources describe the condemned being suspended upside down, often with the feet secured and elevated, while executioners sawed vertically through the body, starting at the groin or midsection. The inverted position was purposeful. It slowed blood flow to the brain, keeping the victim conscious for as long as possible. Pain was drawn out over minutes, or in some accounts, hours, making death a slow and agonizing process. This punishment was reserved for crimes considered extraordinarily heinous, such as treason, murder, or rebellion against a ruler. In societies where law was intertwined with public morality, the act served not only to eliminate a criminal, but also to communicate a stark lesson. Certain transgressions were so extreme that ordinary death was insufficient. The public setting ensured that the message reached as many people as possible. Crowds were forced to confront the consequences of defiance, reinforcing obedience through fear. The psychological impact extended beyond the victim. Witnesses, neighbors, family members, and the general populace were compelled to internalize the authority of the state. Executioners controlled both life and spectacle, turning the act into a ritual of dominance. The deliberate pacing of death made it clear that punishment could be as meticulous and calculated as the law itself. Although modern historians debate the frequency and exact methods of this execution, the recurring references in legal documents and chronicles indicate that it was more than mere legend. The sawing in half stands out as an extreme example of how human ingenuity was applied to prolong agony, transforming punishment into a public demonstration of power. It remains a chilling reminder of the lengths societies have gone to enforce justice through terror. Execution by cannon, sometimes referred to as blown from a gun, was a method employed in parts of the Indian subcontinent during the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly under the British East India Company. This punishment was most often reserved for rebels, mutineers, and those accused of treason against colonial authority, especially during events such as the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Unlike conventional executions, this method combined both immediate death and theatrical spectacle, projecting the power of the state in a uniquely terrifying form. The condemned was tied directly to the mouth of a large cannon. At a signal, the cannon was fired, instantly obliterating the body. Death was instantaneous, but the spectacle of destruction was magnified for witnesses. By choosing prominent locations such as fort walls, town squares, or parade grounds, colonial authorities ensured that entire communities could see and understand the consequences of defying imperial rule. It was a punishment that left no ambiguity. The state could annihilate anyone, and it had the capacity to do so visibly, violently, and without mercy. The method also carried psychological and cultural significance. In a society where honor and bodily integrity were paramount, the complete obliteration of the body denied the condemned any dignity in death. For those witnessing the event, the impact was both immediate and lasting. The cannon became a tool not just of execution, but of intimidation, converting technology into an instrument of social control. Accounts from European officers and Indian chroniclers emphasized the terror inspired by this practice. It was both punishment and propaganda, ensuring that stories of rebellion would be met with horror rather than imitation. Even after the immediate violence ended, the memory of the act would ripple through communities, reinforcing obedience and fear. Execution by cannon exemplifies how governments have historically combined lethality with spectacle. It was a fusion of speed and terror, leaving no question about the power of the authority behind it. By transforming the act of killing into a dramatic, destructive performance, it became one of the most extreme examples of public punishment in history, designed to instill fear across entire cities and regions. Burning at the stake was one of the most widely known and visually terrifying methods of public execution in medieval and early modern Europe. Most prominently, it was used by the Spanish Inquisition to punish heresy, blasphemy, and other crimes considered threats to religious and social order. Unlike punishments aimed solely at ending life, burning at the stake combined physical torment with moral symbolism, turning the act of execution into a lesson for entire communities. The condemned would typically be bound to a wooden stake in a public square, sometimes surrounded by wood and kindling prepared to ignite the flames. Before the fire was lit, the prisoner might be subjected to public humiliation, such as parading through the town or having their head shaved. Once the flames engulfed the body, death came gradually, often taking many minutes. The experience was excruciating. The skin blistered, lungs filled with smoke, and the body eventually succumbed to intense heat and shock. The symbolic element of fire was central to its impact. Fire represented purification, a cleansing of sin or heresy in the eyes of authorities. By watching a condemned individual consumed, spectators were meant to witness the moral consequences of defiance, not just against law, but against divine order. The spectacle reinforced the authority of both the state and the church, emphasizing that ideological transgressions would not be tolerated. The public nature of the punishment amplified its psychological power. Entire towns and city squares would gather to witness the event. Families, neighbors, and even children were forced to confront the violent enforcement of moral and religious codes. The memory of the flames, the agonized screams, and the charred remains left a lasting impression on the community, making the punishment an instrument of societal control long after the execution ended. Burning at the stake remained in use for centuries, particularly in cases of heresy, witchcraft, and rebellion, until shifting legal philosophies and humanistic reforms gradually led to its abolition. Yet it endures in history as one of the most iconic examples of punishment designed to communicate moral and legal authority through fear, pain, and spectacle.